What do we know for sure about this? What can you tell me? Give me some high points about the Song of Solomon that explain its presence and purpose. Why was fertility a big issue? Why was fertility a big issue? There weren't enough people. There weren't enough people. It said at CNN that in the next 40 years there will be another whole population equal to the population of the earth today born. That to feed twice as many people we need 8 times as much food production, which isn't going to happen. And of course all the other stresses on the planet. In the next 40 years, at the current birth rate, it's going to be twice as many people. That's quite a thought, isn't it? Because we're right on the edge of famine now. With this much, to evenly distribute it, we'd have to have twice as much as we're doing now in the way of distribution and production. I don't know. Some of you are older than I. Yes. But was there a time in the 20th century when there weren't enough people? Has this ever been a problem in our lifetime? Shortage of people?
In relation to the amount of land available?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's probably why the United States was starting to get populated. It was because of the overcrowding in Europe, in addition to the religious persecution that forced people to come to this country.
After the Black Death, there were too few people. They didn't have enough people to grow enough food to stay alive in Northern Europe after the Black Death. For the following 100 years or so, they were on the edge of famine constantly because they didn't have enough people. That's the last time that I know about for sure. The Roman Empire was full. The Roman government perceived it to be full. That's why they had birth control. That's why the Romans invented the condom, a good Latin word, because they were after birth control. They wanted to control their population and not have it grow anymore because the Roman Empire was full. Now, of course, this explains something about modern Catholicism. This is an aside. This isn't exegesis. This is historical theology. This is a little for free. The reason the Catholic Church is against birth control is because in Catholicism there are 2 sources of truth. What are the 2 sources of truth in Catholicism? Tradition is number 1, and Scripture is number 2. Why does tradition take precedence over Scripture? Because of the argument that Scripture was created by the church. The church came first, according to this view, and the church is inspired membership then wrote, and that's the Bible, and so the Bible, the canon, is the creation of the church, therefore the church has the right to interpret its own writings. Alright? And when we come to this matter of birth control, we go back to the beginnings of the Christian church and we look at the church in the first 3 centuries. The church in the first 3 centuries was in the Roman world. And what was the church's Bible at that time? What did they have initially? Well, first of all, they took over the canon of the Old Testament. They accepted the Jewish canon in its Western form, and so they have the Old Testament. What does the Old Testament say about fertility? On every page. Yes, on every page and every line, and in between the lines is what? Be fruitful and multiply, right? That's everywhere. And so when the church looked at its Bible, and Nicene Fathers, right in the first 3 centuries, every church father comments on birth control and says what? Says, yeah, it's clearly against the Bible and God's direct command. Therefore, no such thing is acceptable. So the church today, living in this crowded world, because it sees tradition as the number one source of truth, has to continue saying what? They have to stick by the fathers and say, no birth control. That's how Catholicism got where it is. All right? Yeah, because of this Old Testament view that they had. Now, what else is there? What's the other really big thing about Song of Solomon that makes it of significance in the canon? It represents a new departure. What is that departure? Monogamy. Why did I say that was a new departure? Because from the beginning of historical Israel, what was accepted as perfectly appropriate norm? Polygamy was the way. What were the sources of polygamy? Well, of course, the pagan culture. But what made polygamy so desirable? What? Political needs? Soldiers. They need enough people to put in their crops, build the cities, harvest the crops, keep the dams built so that the cisterns were full of water. They needed enough people to have a country. War, yes, was leveling the male population, and so the way to deal with it was have every woman a wife and a mother, have every woman produce children by means of polygamy with all its attendant problems. Well, the law of God in Leviticus placed certain restrictions around polygamy. Couldn't marry mother and daughter. Couldn't marry sisters. Who would have been out on that law? Couldn't marry mother and daughter, couldn't marry sisters. Jacob, yes, Jacob. It's forbidden in Leviticus. Well, of course, Cain and Abel were in the part of the primeval history where that law wasn't revealed yet, according to Israel. The law in Leviticus was revealed where? It's further revelation of truth in their minds. Where does that come in? At Sinai. Yeah. Okay. So, polygamy was the norm. It wasn't the exception, it was the norm. Long passages devoted to marriage in the law, and marriage in the law, the norm of marriage in the law is what? How to deal with your father's wife. You can't marry your father's wife. It's not talking about your mother, it's talking about your father's wife. Why? Yeah, that's right. Remember what Reuben did? What did Reuben do? When Jacob grew old, he took his father's youngest wife and married her by force, attempting to do what? Well, yeah, he was in a big struggle with his brother Judah over who was going to be successor. Actually, they didn't know, it's part of the humor of the story, they didn't know what? There was something that Judah and Reuben didn't know, which was what? They're having this big struggle for the succession. They didn't know that Joseph was still alive and was going to be the true successor. Yeah. All right? But the point is that there's a norm for marriage in the law. The law discusses marriage a lot. And it never discusses marriage in a single verse under the assumption that marriage is a man and a woman. Don't marry your father's daughter because she's your sister. Talking about a half-sister, become another wife. Yeah. All sorts of rules like that, making the assumption that polygamy is the norm, and this is how a holy people relate to each other in families when families are polygamous. That's the norm. Okay, why the change in Solomon's time? Why the change in Solomon's time? Yeah. After 15 years or so of peace, what do you have? You have a generation of adult males. 15 years or so? Yes, why? Yes, because after 14 or so, a man would be of childbearing age, okay? So they had an age of peace. Peace brought about the possibility of enough men so that you could have a new kind of marriage, which was monogamous marriage. Now, this is going to seem funny, but let me just ask you, how do you think? There were lots of innovations under David and Solomon. David and Solomon did lots of new things that hadn't been done before. How did the conservative element, not necessarily linked with the older people, but to some extent, how did the older or the more conservative, I'll say and or, feel about the innovations of David and Solomon? When David and Solomon made changes, and they ended the tribal militia and instead had a standing army, when they had a national capital and put the ark there without any prior approval, when they redistricted the country so that the old tribal divisions weren't there anymore, how did folks feel about that? Yeah, there was a lot of feeling. It was this feeling that accounted for the strong, I would say nearly constant tendency to rebellion during David's rule. Why were David's own sons, among others, so able to get large parts of the population away from David? Because there wasn't a certainty that David was doing the right thing. Now, when Solomon came along, he made even greater changes, right? And among those changes that would be most dramatic would be allowing a new selfish kind of marriage. Ooh, did you hear what I said? A new selfish kind of marriage. I would say, listen carefully because it's not going to make sense initially. A new selfish, lustful kind of marriage. Under Solomon and in the Song of Solomon, there is a new, selfish, lustful kind of marriage suggested. Now, I'm speaking here as the devil's advocate on behalf of the conservative population in Solomon's.
Would that be a marriage more out of love than just out of propagation?
Out of love more than propagation, what you really mean is you want to choose
A woman?
on your own?
No, not necessarily, but yeah, why not?
On your own? You don't see some beautiful girl and go choose her, huh? What's the appropriate way for a marriage? And if he can choose her, and it's the right thing socially or politically in your village, that's fine, but what else? What? If Uncle Laban has an older, uglier sister, then what? Then you marry her first. That's the way it is. And you don't say, I'm going to pass on the older sister and what? Because she's the pretty one that I like, and she's more popular and so forth. This was considered an outrageous idea. If you let people choose their own spouses, what could happen? Yeah, the older one might never get married. And not have what? Children. And a woman older, unmarried, and no children is going to do what? Starve. Yeah.
Also, though, if this was being promoted by the king, this type of life, wouldn't there also be a problem with a man trying to get multiple wives, because there wouldn't be that many to go around? So wouldn't there be more trouble or more fighting over a particular woman within the tribe?
There you go. If you don't have this all arranged in advance, some pretty girl might have what?
Already been asked for?
Well, see, you make these arrangements when everybody's a child and it doesn't matter. But if you let people choose their own spouses, what might happen? Some people will get left out, and other people what? Will have more than one person trying to marry them, and that could make for all sorts of trouble. Do you see this idea of one man and one woman is headed for trouble? I don't think it was the king per se who was promoting it. It was the wisdom. It was the wisdom school that was promoting it. And Song of Solomon is part of the production of that wisdom school, and they were promoting all sorts of things that people thought, out in the villages thought, this is another of those crazy ideas foisted on us by the family of David. Yes?
I'd be especially bitter as a conservative when I look at what Solomon himself was doing.
Oh, yeah. If you were conservative and the king's court is promoting this monogamous view of marriage, and the king himself has 60 wives, that's what it says here. But the Song of Solomon promotes a marriage between one man and one woman, but it mentions the king's 60 wives. But of course, the wisdom school would have said, that's different. Right? There you go. Yes. That's right. The answer to that would have been, those marriages were what? Those weren't marriages. What were those? Those were political alliances. Some gal is sent down by the king of Geshur, and she's the new queen. Okay, hello, hi. Right over there on that mountain over there is where we built palaces for you queens. Go over there and get to know the other wives, and you'll have your own house. We'll build you one. And what's the name of your god? Did you bring a priest along to? This is how it was done. Okay. So, yes, I'm sure that the king won no friends from this viewpoint. Why would the wisdom teachers have pushed monogamy anyway? Sounds like a half-baked idea now that you think about it. Why would the wisdom teachers have been so foolish as to promote monogamy anyway?
Were they reading Genesis and the Proverbs there because of this is a way of avoiding a lot of heartache and trouble?
Well, for one thing, it certainly solves the problem of patrimony. Politically, who inherits from whom? If you've got 12 wives, and therefore 12 firstborn, what problem do you have? Yeah, who's going to inherit? How? These were constant problems. Yes, which go away when you have one family, one wife, and therefore the wives aren't squabbling among themselves about whose children are going to inherit. Why? There's no question. The husband and wife's children are going to inherit. That was one big problem solved. And of course, you didn't have these constant problems about, oh, he married his sister, his father's daughter, and all those things. Then you had to deal with that problem and so forth. What were some other reasons? He said you have to bring inspiration into it. The question is, did God want it that way? Did he impress upon them to do this because it would be better? Now remember, initially the idea is that this is somewhat more, the resistance against it is obvious. Whenever you make a major social change, you can be sure there's going to be resistance. And the resistance is obvious, especially at the outset. Now as time passed, the resistance died down, and it became the norm what? A man's going to have one wife, and if a man chooses 4 wives, what? Well, that's still okay, but what? That's not the norm, and that would be looked on as somewhat strange. This, of course, led to the other problem, and that is the constant danger that if you have one husband and one wife, it may not work out. That's a risk you take all the time, right? And therefore, what are you going to have? Divorce. Which you didn't have to have before, because if it didn't work out, yes, there were others to go on to, yes. Now, when did the Hebrews celebrate their marriages? When was this marriage relation actually conducted? Feast times. Well, there were 7 annual feasts. The fall of the spring. Why do you say that? No, that's not a good enough answer. Yes.
In Africa, they were conducted at the birth of the first child.
At the birth of the first child, that's when you got married? There's some validity to that, I would see. That makes sense, theologically. If you've produced offspring, then God has blessed it. It's really a marriage. So you could argue that. Well, when would you get married? Well, yeah, why? What's... Yeah, well, yeah. Yeah, harvest and planting are the same time. Remember that in Palestine they had this unusual situation where there were how many New Years? 2. One in the spring, one in the fall, so the 7th month is the first month. That's how you look at it. You can get 14 months squeezed into 12 that way. There was planting and harvest in the spring and planting and harvest in the fall. So which one was the new year? Which one was the new year then? Spring? Yeah, well, you got spring and you got fall, so you had a choice. Well, of course, what feast did they celebrate in the spring? This might help. What was the spring feast? What was it? Passover. What did Passover commemorate? Well, you know, Israel has a tendency to historicize all these myths. Do you think the Canaanites, I know you know the answer to this, do you think the Canaanites had a spring festival? What? Well, they lived there first. Well, and then they continued to live there. Isn't that true? And they worship nature and the forces of nature, right? So what must have been in Canaan before Israel? Easter. Well, I think you meant Ishtar, didn't you? That is to say, the divine marriage between Baal and Ishtar, producing fertility in the world. Okay. So the point is that there was a spring agricultural festival. The Canaanites celebrated this festival for a week in the spring. And what week did Israel choose? Well, of course, the same week. The first day after the new year that you started cutting the grain and so forth. All right. So, of course, it's going to be the same week. And when the Hebrews and the Canaanites were living side by side, what were they doing? Yes, and celebrating the same. And, of course, the Canaanites said, this is because we're getting this fertility past and looking forward to fertility future because Baal has married Ishtar. But, of course, Israel demythologized all the time. They didn't say that at all. What did they say? No. Spring festival now. What did they say? They said, oh, this is because Yahweh brought us out from Egypt with a mighty hand. At the spring, at this very new moon week in the spring, this is when he brought us out. Okay? All right. Now then, what happened at the fall festival? There was another New Year. What did they do now? Now they're bringing in the vintage harvest. What did they do? Bringing in the vintage harvest, now what? And putting in the grain harvest. Yeah, it's another close and opening. So, again, they have a harvest in, a harvest home, and they're putting in another crop. And so, it's the time of the fall rains, spring and fall rains. So, what are they celebrating again? They're celebrating fertility past and fertility future. Okay. Now, how did they celebrate this one? Well, one of the things they did after they harvested the trees was they pruned them. You're aware of that, right? And when they were in the extensive orchards for the vintage harvest, they didn't go home at night. Some of these orchards were miles away from the village, and you couldn't get up in the morning and walk to the orchard and work and then walk home. Either you wouldn't be sleeping or you wouldn't be getting much done during the day. Where did they stay during the harvest? What? In the groves, of course. And what kind of shelter did they have in the groves? What? From the vegetation that they were pruning. They built little booths. Okay, in the fall harvest. And of course, in the fall harvest, this is the fertility of Baal's, his fight over death, and the fall rains come. That's not what the Hebrews said. What did the Hebrews say? Oh, we live in these booths. Why? We live in these booths. Why? This is how Israel lived when? In the wilderness, when Yahweh brought them out of Egypt. So what are they celebrating again? Celebrating the Exodus again. Yes. At the Exodus, what happened theologically? Salvation. Yes. Salvation, which is, we would call that a new, the Old Testament does this too. Yes, and a new what? A new beginning. Come on. We're talking fertility here. Oh yes, this is what it says in the law, in Numbers, Leviticus. We call it a new birth. Yeah? So, we have the historicizing of ancient myth into historical events. It's the Exodus we're celebrating in the spring and in the fall. Okay? And that was the point at which God became our king. Yahweh became king in Israel. When did he become king? When did he become king? Well, now see, here's where our concept of time and events are different from theirs. We would say two things immediately as far as God's kingship. What would we say? Number one, he was always king. Yes, he was always king. And as far as becoming king, how often would he become king? Well, to us, he would become king how often? Once. Because we have time stretched out over this linear timeline, right? And of course, they didn't have time stretched over a timeline. How did they have time? And they cycle. So that, I have to go this way. Am I going right? Is this clockwise? Okay, yeah. So that, again, when you come to the end, you're coming to the beginning. And so the events of that end are also a creation. And they happen how often? As often as you pass through that cycle. Okay. So God could become king how often? The role of the king in Song of Solomon is important, and this is part of the whole complex of ideas in the song. How often would God become king? Twice a year. Well, only once historically, but what? We live through it again and again. Yes. All right. So, let's take a look at parallel image. Oh, so, by the way, it's a chiasm, we said. Song of Solomon is a chiasm. And there are 4 scenes and 4 scenes leading up to the apex, right? The mirror image of each other. That's what a chiasm is. Okay? 4 scenes and 4 scenes mirror image to each other, with the point of the song, the important part of the song being where? Yeah, where do we tend to put the important point when we write today? At the end. We get a conclusion. In a chiasm, the conclusion is where? In the exact center. Okay? So, the marriage covenant is in the exact center. It's scenes 4 and 5. Now, not surprisingly from what we've said, what time of year is represented in Song of Solomon? From what we've said so far, you ought to be able to figure this out without goofing it up, and Richard has to be quiet. What time of the year is represented? The spring. Okay? But see, I trapped you. It was very easy. Why did you say the spring? And you said it so firmly, too. It sounded like the truth when you said it. Why did you say the spring? Flowers coming out, right. That's good. Now, I thought you were going to surely mention something else related to the spring. Something that everybody knows from Song of Solomon. The voice of the turtle is heard in the land. I was sure you were going to mention the turtle dove. Because, of course, that dove appears when? It's on its spring migration. It's coming back. Right? Okay. That's spring. But the example you gave was a bad one. You said it mentions flowers coming out. Okay. Why was that a bad example to defend his spring argument? Yes, because in the latter rain, what happens? In November, this isn't New England now, this is Palestine. In November, what happens? The fields are covered with flowers. Why? Because of the later rains. The latter rain brings out the fall foliage, the flowers. Yeah. We have to sort of think of it as a second spring. Yeah. So now from what I've said, let me ask again, since it's a chiasm, a mirror image with four scenes, balancing four scenes in the marriage covenant in the center, what do you think is the time background in Song of Solomon? What? Honey and wine. Honey is made from what? And the wine is made from what? The grapes, oh, well, actually not grapes, what? Fruit. What is that, 5:1? Exactly so. Yeah. Yeah, honeycomb, honey, wine, milk, which of course is yogurt, curded milk. Yes. We've talked a little bit in the afternoon about the Feast of Tabernacles. We're going to talk more about it. But this is clearly what? There's no question about it. That's what? That's the fall harvest. Yeah. Take a guess. Take a wild guess. How many scenes are spring scenes and how many scenes are fall scenes? There are 8 scenes. Now go way out on the limb. It's a chiasm. 4 and 4, of course. So, what's the answer to the question? What's the time setting of Song of Solomon?
A whole year.
Oh, you're not catching it.
It must start in the spring, the apex in the fall, and then
Yeah. Well, of course, the two harvests are parallel to each other. We have 4 spring scenes and 4 fall scenes. This is what we would expect. So what's the time setting? The spring harvest and the fall harvest. Okay? Now, what? Oh, no. Yeah. Tense in Hebrew is determined by context. An action is complete or incomplete, but what's the problem with complete or incomplete action? An action could be incomplete in the past, and because of this mythic view of time, an action can be complete when? In the future, yes. Therefore, when you see the verb in its completed or incompleted form, you have to determine how will I translate that into tense. Present tense, the Lord is king, could mean what? Yeah. It could mean the Lord is king for eternity. It could be simply a statement, he has been, always was, is now, and will continue to be always king. But what else could it mean? This is what happened. They made a festal shout, and they said, Absalom is king. That was the first day of Absalom's revolt. How would we translate that? Well, Absalom had proclaimed himself king, and his followers said what? Well, how would we translate that to get across the idea of tenses? Well, he had named himself king already, just that day. Huh? Well, but he wasn't saying that he was going to be king. He was saying what?
He has to be
That's what I would say. Absalom has become king. When? Just now. That's the English tense that would express that. And later on, when Absalom was dead, Abiathar and some others took Adonijah down and they anointed him, and the story was what? Adonijah is king. How would we translate it? They gave this royal shout of acclamation, and we would say Adonijah has become king. Yeah, all right. Well, that's Psalm, let's see, let's pick a Psalm. How about Psalm 93? Well, just look at Psalm 93. The Lord reigns, that is, Yahweh reigns. He is robed in majesty. Yahweh is robed, he is girded with strength. Yea, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Thy throne is established from of old, thou art from everlasting. Of course, the tenses here don't make any sense, and they don't tell you anything about what's actually going on. When would such a psalm have been sung? When did the Lord reign? Well, we would say, from a Western viewpoint, forever. That's clearly not the intention of the psalm. It's not the intention of the psalm to say that, because it says that in a second verse. Here at first, what's it talking about? Catch this, you'll catch Song of Solomon. Psalm 93, verse 1. How would we translate this? And to what does it refer? Anyone? The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He's girded with strength. Yea, the world is established. It shall never be moved. To what does this refer? Becoming king at the festival. Well, which festival? Spring, yes, initially. Which festival becomes the most prominent one eventually? What? Well, they were both harvest. The big one became eventually the fall festival. The fall festival eventually took precedence over the spring festival, though they continued to celebrate the spring festival as a new year. Yes, then if you are correct, Roy, how would you translate this then? I wouldn't say the Lord reigns. How could I get across in English what's being described here? The Lord has become king. Well, how would you say the Lord reigns? The Lord has begun to reign. Yeah. We could get it even more simply with the insertion of the word now. That would imply what's here. You could say what? The Lord now reigns, which implies what? This has happened when? Just now. The Lord now reigns. He's now robed in majesty. The Lord is now robed. He's girded with strength. Yes. Yes. The world is now established. What is the new year? It's the moment of what? The new year is the moment of what? Rebirth, which is to say what? What other word? Creation. The harvest festival was the moment of the celebration of the recreation of the world. The old cycle is over, right? That fertility cycle is ended. What must now begin? A new cycle of fertility. In effect, God must do what? He must recreate the world. He must recreate the world in this new cycle of fertility. The world is now established. It shall never now be moved. Why is this possible? Now we go to the other. From the re-happening, we go to the other, which is that which has always been the case. Thy throne has been established from of old, thou art from everlasting. What did the Lord have to do to establish the world at the moment of creation? You'll see this again and again and again in the Psalm. In these Psalms of the new year, in these Psalms of the enthronement of Yahweh, get what I said, in these Psalms of the enthronement of Yahweh, what did he have to do to create the world? Now, to answer this, you can't read Genesis 1. To answer this, you have to read all these Psalms and know something about the Baal epic. What did he have to do to create the world? Who did he have to fight? Where? He fought Mot, death, which is the same as Leviathan, the dragon of chaos, which is the same as Yam, which is the what? Who's Yam? The sea. What was the sea? The sea was the realm of, you all know this because you're Adventists and you know all those symbols from Revelation without knowing where they came from. What does the sea represent? And when the sea is roaring, what's happening? It's chaos, it's war. And God's establishment of the order of creation is what? Is the fight with dragon sea. And the conquest of sea is the moment of creation. Let's see what it says here. The floods have lifted up, O Yahweh. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Mightier than the thunders of many waters. Mightier than the waves of the sea. Is Yahweh on high, mighty. What is that about? You will see in these Psalms of the enthronement of Yahweh, again and again and again, that suddenly, for no apparent reason, but for every good reason, we are talking about what? Talking about the sea. And the sea roaring and raging and being stilled and crushed by God. That's the victory over the sea, which is the same as what? Order out of chaos. Which historically is related to what? Yes, the limitation of the water and the calling forth of the dry land in Genesis 1, which is historically to be related to what? Crossing at the sea, where God controlled the sea and drove it back before his people. So that the creation of Israel is equivalent to the creation of the world. And when did all this happen? It happened at the New Year festival. And when was the New Year festival? In the spring or in the fall. Since this is the moment of creation, since this is the moment of fertility, since this is the moment of order out of chaos and the establishment of the fertility of the new cycle, this is an opportune time to do what? This would be the best time of the year to get married. Why? Because then you will enjoy what? You'll not only enjoy fertility, what else? Your house will be blessed with what? Well, you'll not only will you enjoy fertility, but what else? What will you not have? God has established order out of chaos. So what? So you won't have in your house chaos. Your house will be orderly. If you want a time when you want to get married but you don't have children. Suppose you want to get married and don't have children. Well, get married in the winter, during the dry season. And what will happen? See, this is the mythic mind at work. What will happen? You won't have children. Get married before the new year, the month before the new year. When the sea hasn't been stilled, what will you have? You'll have a very chaotic married life. You'll fight all the time. If you don't want that, if you want children in an ordered house, then what? Then get married. So I can hear some people thinking, well, that's the problem. I didn't get married at the right time. If only I got married at the right time of the year. Yes. So, it came to be the custom in this monogamous new relationship. You know, there's sexual activity at camp meetings. I'm sorry I said that, but I said it. And there was sexual activity at the Feast of Tabernacles. The people got married then. When I say the people, I mean what? The what? The people. Who? Those who weren't married. Well, how old were those who weren't married and were getting married now? 14, 15. The young girls, it says in the Mishnah, dressed themselves in white and garland. They put this crown, this marriage crown on, and they went out into the fields and the vineyards around Jerusalem. And they danced and they sang the Song of Solomon. And what did the young boys do? Yes, they went out and they made their choices. And when they made those choices, what did they have thereafter? What was that? When the young boys brought back this girl, this 13 or 14-year-old girl, this 13 or 14-year-old girl was what? Here, mother, father, and remember mother and father were young themselves, grandmother, grandfather, this is my what? This is my wife. And that's how marriage was conducted for centuries in Judah at the time of the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall. And that's how Song of Solomon was used. It was sung as part of the festival of the enthronement of God at the moment in the festival during the 8 days when the children were expected to do what? To go get married. Interesting. A little unusual from our perspective. After all, the nation would be blessed and be fertile if what? If those who weren't married what? Got married. All right, thank you very much. We'll take up this theme again next week.